Intro to Danny Woodburn.
Hi, Danny Woodburn. I am a little person. Um, I'm currently wearing my reading glasses because it's easier to see the computer. And I have a dark beard, and as I always say, the hairline of a cruise ship captain. Uh, and I'm wearing a brown and black and white gingham style shirt with a blue sweater over it. I began in this industry in the early 90s. Uh, I've been a SAG card holder since 1991. Um, my first television appearances was on as a guest star on a show called Hunter, uh, which I think I notoriously canceled that show sometime after my appearance. I always say that, so many shows I came on at their last season. But most people know me from the show Seinfeld. I did a, a bunch of those back in the 90s. And films I've appeared in, some of my favorites are Death to Smoochie, Jingle All the Way, and Watchmen. And as far as my career goes, I began on the stage and went to Temple University School of Communications and Theater. I studied there. I studied film, actually, but also did a lot of work in the theater department uh, in all aspects uh, and as a performer on a number of plays back then. And then I moved to Los Angeles. And back then, you literally pounded the pavement, went door to door to try to meet agents and try to get representation. It's a whole different beast today, of course.
Danny Woodburn on theater accessibility. When you moved to LA, can you tell us a bit about why you were against typecast?
Absolutely. When I came from the theater, I was, always people got to know me. I was always cast in roles that they felt I was right for, and it never felt like, never felt like a typecasting in that sense. In the kinds of roles that little people get, the creatures or sort of sight gags or whatever. I in one piece I played uh like a street thug. In another piece I played a dad. Um, uh, another piece I played a Honduran nightclub owner. I did all these different kinds of roles, and but when I moved to LA, um, I wasn't being seen or taken seriously as an actor because they just saw the package of me having dwarfism. And so the kinds of roles that came with that are creatures or uh, but mostly creatures wasn't what bothered me so much as these sort of disembodied objects, things with no real um, humanity to them, or they were used as sight gags. And I saw these things happening, and I really wanted to do what I could in my career to steer clear of that. So it did, from time to time, it did cost me in terms of not being seen for a role because I objected to something in the script or uh, but sometimes it actually helped me. There was a television series called Silk Stockings back in the day, and there was a lot of pathos around my character's size, him being ashamed of it or him having problems with his size, and I just felt like that really wasn't true to the experience of little people. And so we sort of went back and forth and tried to come up with a different idea for his character's pathos, and it was really about having a wife that was cheating on him more than anything else. So the character was a killer, and he was killing the quote unquote boyfriends or one night stands of his wife, um, all the while posing as her butler, but he was really her husband. So he's this sort of cuckolded guy, um, and that was a big shift in the script. And then another time I worked on the series Bones, and they had a lot of the medical stuff completely wrong about dwarfism. So we talked about, and it's a medical show, so we talked about that, and I gave them a lot of insight. And I think as a result of that conversation, I was actually cast. So I went back multiple times on that show Bones as the head of the State Department, which was such an unusual role for someone like me to get. But it was important for me to make things real, you know, throughout my career as a performer.
Were the theaters themselves that you started out at, were they accessible?
I mean, first of all, I began my career in the 80s, so it was before the ADA, before any of those laws came into, they didn't have curb cuts so much back then even. And so it was before any of those laws came into effect. And even today, theaters are largely not accessible to wheelchair users. As if you want to be an audience member, yes, there's accessible seating. But if you want to be a performer, that's a completely different story. If you want to get your training on the stage, it's not readily available to find spaces where you can get this kind of training as someone with a mobility disability who maybe can't take the stairs very well. And I didn't have those issues back then when I was in college. I certainly didn't like the stairs. I took elevators when I could, but they didn't keep me from getting from A to B, unless it was like 10 flights that I'm not taking the stairs for any reason. But yeah, so that they weren't accessible, and they're still not very accessible in large part.
Danny Woodburn on auditioning and accessibility. Tell us about auditioning and accessibility, especially when it comes to wheelchair users.
Yeah, I had gone into audition for a character that was a wheelchair user, but there was some question in the script as to whether or not this person really needed a wheelchair or if they were faking it, but it was never really clear. It was for a pilot for a show. And there was no reason that a wheelchair user could not be seen for the role. And certainly, wheelchair use is not a finite thing. You're not either in or out. Some people use a wheelchair from time to time. Some people use crutches or a walker from time to time. It's not a finite thing. So the idea that they would hold auditions for a wheelchair user on a second floor in a facility with no elevator was discriminatory, and right away took out the element of even considering an actor in a wheelchair unconsciously. So that's the clear example of unconscious bias. The assumption here being we're not going to find an actor in a wheelchair, so we're not even going to give him the opportunity.
Danny Woodburn on the film industry and disability. Tell us about your experience with the film industry.
I think a lack of understanding, disability on the whole. There's always this I think stigma around disability that you can't, right? So the idea is they can't do X, Y, or Z. They can't. So they'll be asked. A person would ask, well, how can you play that role? How can you do that? And I think it's the responsibility of employers to not say how can you, but how can we? How can we make this work? So it falls on their shoulders because they're the employers, and by law they are responsible for creating accessible workspaces, and whatever that means in this ever-changing climate of work that we are in. And we see how much it's changed. I mean, we've seen entire productions done online through Zoom. We've seen entire films shot that way now. This all occurred over the pandemic. So it sort of took something that affects everyone to sort of open the door for the disability community in a lot of ways. Something that made everyone say, well, I can't go to work. It's not accessible to me because there's the risk of getting this virus. And so we went online, a large part of us, and almost all of us, except those in the service industry, we were online at work. And so I think the realization there is we can create accessible spaces. And the same is true, and it doesn't have to be online. I mean, there's other ways to do it, but the same is true in workspace. So here's a prime example. I had a role that I did a few years back, and my character is singing and dancing, which I had done in a number of shows, but this was like I was getting ready to have another hip replaced, and so my dancing down steps was not going to happen. But that's what the director wanted. He wanted to see me coming down steps, but he knew my mobility issues, and so we worked out a situation where we took a camera seesaw and we rigged it so that I could stand on one end of the camera seesaw, and the guys, the grips, would dolly back and move the seesaw up and down with me on it, and we have a close-up shot of what looks like me coming down the steps one at a time, but it's in close-up, but you see the background. I'm coming down the steps. um, Meanwhile, I'm just mounted on a camera seesaw while the crew dollies back with me, and that's me just sort of dancing in close-up on the steps, as it were. So that was an adaptation to create an accessible workspace. And that comes from engagement, direct engagement with the disability community, direct engagement with individuals who are employed or are going to be employed. And so one of the things I do is I work with studios to facilitate that engagement.
Danny Woodburn on engagement. Tell us about how you facilitated engagement in the film industry.
Well, I talked to a number of studios, and my partner and I, we have this plan essentially that we present to them, and we say, here's what you need to understand about the language of disability. Here's what you need to understand about accessible spaces in all aspects of every type of disability. So we sort of break it down by, whether it be physical disability, cognitive, emotional disability. We break it down, and try to cover all the bases as much as possible, and talk to them in broader strokes about, like I said, this idea of asking the question of your prospective employee or your current employee, how can we make this work? What are some of the needs that you would have to do the best job that you can do? And I think that's a question that you can ask anybody, and it doesn't put you at risk of, people have this idea that people with disabilities are litigious, which is an absurdity, because they like to capitalize on like one or two stories of some nut job who's out there who feels the world has come down around his shoulders or her shoulders and said, well, I'm going to sue everybody that does it wrong. And so they get into this mode of self-defense. And so we try to clear them of that fear, talk to them about how to engage with this community, and things to know when working to employ this community. And after 33 years of the ADA, it's sort of shocking still to not see how industries haven't made the shift. And really, the shift has only been happening in our industry, like legitimately happening, in the last 6 years. But we're talking about 115, 120 years of filmmaking. And we're talking about 33 years of the ADA. And we're still at a place where we can't get the same opportunity, and we can't, sometimes we can't even audition for the roles that we would be right for. And we're certainly not getting the opportunity to audition for roles that are nondescript, that have no bearing on disability whatsoever. So, explaining to studios how best to engage has been sort of the way in which we get the studios to do that, and to consider employing and casting, and also creating databases of people with disabilities above and below the line. During the pandemic, my partner and I produced a number of online series, which we won the Shorty Award for, and the Gold Anthem Webby Award for, showing that you can hire people with disabilities in front of and behind the camera. So we did a series of online sort of performance variety shows, but like the first one was all about the ADA, the 5 titles of the ADA. We sort of broke it down, and we had comedians and singers and dancers, and then we had people, behind the scenes doing the editing work, and doing line producing work, doing production coordinating work, PAs. Everybody had disability, and we employed over 150 people over the course of those years, and everybody got some form of payment for their work, whatever their contribution was. And it might have just been something as simple as, here's a video I did 5 years ago. This is me performing this. can you put it in the show? And, you know, most of the time we would say yes, because it was good work and we were excited to add it to our collection and to give this person an opportunity and to give them a check for at least $150 at the very minimum, just for giving us their work.
Danny Woodburn on opportunities for all ages. Tell us about who can best benefit from these opportunities.
Well, that's another thing. We've been pitching a kids show that uses 4 kids, diverse backgrounds, each with a disability, and each will be authentically represented. And so we have that out in the casting arena now, and we're looking for those folks. And whatever comes of that, at the very least, we'll create more opportunities to have some of these kids on file. And these are kids between 11 and 14 that we're looking at. And so we do have those engagements, and some of the kids, some of the people that were in our shows, the ADA Lead On shows, and you can see those on leadonada.org, LEADADA.org, LEADON ADA.org. You can see some of those shows, and you'll see that we had a number of kids performing in those episodes. So yeah, it's not just about adults, for sure.
Reading Danny Woodburn on authentic representation. Tell us about the importance of authentic representation.
Yeah, I always say that if somebody is trying to claiming to want to cast a disabled performer, my barometer is, if I haven't heard about the project, then they didn't really try, because our network is very fine-tuned into what's coming across the board. We're constantly emailing, anywhere from, members of the Casting Society of America to, which also when Russell Bose was president, they created their own database. They went nationwide and they auditioned hundreds of people nationwide and just to create this database. And I think we got probably maybe 1,000 or more folks on that database. And we have Anita Hollander, who's chairman of Performers with Disabilities Committee at SAG and AFTRA. She has a watchdog report where each of us in the union, whenever we get a job, we report to her. If a person with disability, we report to her. We make a list so we know who's working and what types of jobs they've gotten. So there's always ways to track down folks. And like I said, I probably have 35 to 40 kids under 15 who are neurodiverse now added to this database that I just got in putting out this casting. So there's always ways in which to do these searches, and people claim, oh, it's going to take me a year. They're not really looking. They're just putting out this negative at the top and pretending that it's an impossible task when it really isn't.
Danny Woodburn on the Oscars and diversity. Tell us about your experience with the Oscars and diversity.
Yeah. So 2016 was a big year for the Academy because that's when the Oscars So White hashtag appeared. And so the campaign became to diversify the Academy. And in so doing, they added 100 members of whom they felt had diverse backgrounds. But none of those 100 members were people that identified as a person with disability. So they didn't care about or consider at that time the fact that disability is its own marginalized community, is its own diversity. And so it was overlooked. And when a number of us approached the president at that time to say, you're looking beyond disability here in the scope of the marginalized communities that you want represented at the Academy. And we feel that you should, make sure to incorporate people with disabilities. And the answer we got back at that time was no. Sort of to our disbelief, the requirement needed to be that they had they were a member of some other marginalized community first, and that disability was not its own diversity.
Danny Woodburn on disability bias. Tell us about how biases around disability has changed within the industry.
Yeah, I have since that president has left, I have worked a bit more closely with the academy, and we discussed these issues at length. And there's programs now. I was involved in the what's called the Gold program, Academy Gold program, where they take folks from different backgrounds and sort of give them a training, offer them internships. And we made sure, it was probably in the year before the pandemic, we made sure that program included the idea that disability would be a part of it. And so we ensured that they would find someone, at the very least one person with disability, and bring them into that program. So they have shifted their ideology on the subject since the change.
How have views on disability through media changed throughout the years?
I think, even in my own career, as I talked about, there's always sort of a trope around the kind of characters that I would play, and disability certainly has its tropes. The angry disabled man, the guy who maybe lost his arm and is angry and is getting back at the world, or the cure. We have to find a cure for this person, and then they become whole. Or they're some sort of angelic. They have some sort of angelic power. They're super ultra good. Or they're magical in some way. All these tropes around disability, and now a lot of that, because there's more of an awareness of these tropes, that they're being avoided, and that we're just casting people for the sake of casting people, not because, well, it'd be interesting to make this person blind, but yet they can really see other things. They have this superpower where they see, and that's a classic. That's a classic disability trope, because you don't have the value necessarily. And, like, for example, Daredevil is a classic example of that. He doesn't necessarily have value as the blind man, but as a superhero who's blind, who has, super senses, this sort of, bat sonar, and this sixth sense, and all these other sort of, in essence, magical abilities. And I like Daredevil. I think it's a great hero idea, but we're sort of past that idea of creating those kinds of characters now. So I can see Daredevil in a historical context, but I also realize that this was sort of the ideology around disability at the time.
Danny Woodburn on disability porn. Tell us about disability porn.
It's a way to sort of glorify the person helping the disabled person, right? So you always see these stories on the news of the cheerleader who took the kid with Down syndrome to the prom, and it's like, okay, but there's not, who gets the story? The kid with the Down syndrome, or the beautiful blonde cheerleader, who was gracious enough to step down a notch to take the kid with Down syndrome to the prom, it makes me want to go back and see the follow-up report with the kid with Down syndrome, and say, well, did you get a kiss goodnight from the prom? Are you going to see her again? Are you going to go out with her again? It's just a way to sort of glorify the helpers of those with disability, or we use the person with disability to inspire ourselves, right? So we watch the guy with who's a double amputee, and he rolls his way across the country, and we upplay the disability part of it, instead of upplay who he is as a person. You know what I mean? It's more interesting that he's a double amputee than it is that what he might be doing this cause for. Maybe it's for veterans or whatever. Maybe that's, and he's not a veteran. Who knows? I don't know. It's just a way in which to cover these kinds of stories that doesn't sort of glorify the disability as a way to make us feel better about ourselves. And if you're looking at somebody and going, well, at least it's not me, then it's kind of in the disability quote unquote porn zone.
Danny Woodburn on the Woodburn Ratio. Tell us about the Woodburn Ratio.
So the Woodburn Ratio is an idea that I came up with in meeting with Bryan Cranston. As you probably are aware, Bryan worked on this film, The Upside. He played a quadriplegic character. And there was a lot of sort of uproar that came out from the disability community about him taking that role. And the philosophy has always been, well, isn't it acting? And I agree, it is acting. And I think anybody should be able to play any role. But I don't think we should be able to dismiss the access to opportunity, the access to employment as an acceptable part of that kind of casting, right? So we can't just dismiss that as that's not really part of the equation, because it is part of the equation. Part of the equation is that people with disabilities don't get the same opportunity, we don't get the same education, we don't get the same access to representation, and we don't get the same access to auditions. So you have to acknowledge that that's part of the equation. And the best way to acknowledge that is if you are going to take a role from someone who has disability, who could potentially play that role. And like I said, we're not going to get to that point of being an A-list character, A-list performer like Bryan Cranston, somebody with marquee name, someone whose name is going to appear on the marquee underneath the title of the film, right? But it's going to say The Upside, Bryan Cranston, right? So we're not going to get that opportunity to be in his position to sell a picture if we can't get the same kinds of opportunities that he's had coming up. And so I feel it incumbent upon those that take these opportunities away to give them back, right? So I said to Bryan, look, if you're going to be in a position like this where you take a role from a person with disability, then you have to give back 3. So for every 1 role you take as a performer who's A-list character or a director or producer who's saying, we want to cast this person who's not disabled in this disabled role, we will make sure to cast 3 others. And I've had directors speak to me directly about it and ask me, tell me what that is and why do you do it? And the studios and directors are very amenable to the idea. And I think it's a way for us to create access and to create opportunity for people with disabilities to be on screen and working.
Danny Woodburn on the Screen Actors Guild. Tell us your experience with the Screen Actors Guild.
Yeah, so very early on, I came out and heard about the Performance and Disabilities Committee at SAG, which is now SAG-AFTRA. But I heard about it and I sort of involved myself extraneously, just sort of on the outskirts. I went to the meetings from time to time, but I saw that this sort of half-hearted, attempts to get casting directors to come, and sometimes we get a sub come in and talk to all these people with disabilities and tell, then have these casting directors tell these people with disabilities what they have to do to get noticed, which was, so totally not applicable to their circumstance. But they would collect headshots, and I doubt that any of them were ever seen by any of these casting directors. So I thought, there's got to be a shift here that has to occur. And so one of the shifts was to make this a contractual obligation on some level for the AMPTP to take an interest in this community. And so what we did in the 2010 negotiations of the contracts is we said, we're going to create between the SAG-AFTRA, PWD, and performers a task force in association with the AMPTP, our employers with whom we are currently striking and negotiating with, create this joint task force to have discussions about what are the needs of this community, how do we create more access, how do we bring an understanding to our employers about how best to navigate and employ and work with people with disabilities to create more opportunities for them. Because I think they see that this is a real area that should be focused on. And so we created that task force, and we met a number of times. and we're still contracted with them, but nothing's happening right now. And so hopefully once these negotiations are back up, and we're all no longer on the picket lines, we can get back to the business at hand.
Have you seen positive benefits from this?
I think it was I think that in 2010, the GLAD report that came out in 2010 that talked about where we are on screen. It was the first time that there was a depiction of disability on screen in terms of statistics. So at the time, in network primetime TV, there were 6 characters with disability and only 1 represented on screen by a performer with disability. That was Robert David Hall in CSI. And so that report, along with this task force, was I think the spark that lit the fire. So fast forward 13 years, and this is where we're at. We're engaging even more directly, not so much with the legal teams of our employers, but with the actual employers themselves.
Bringing it back to yourself, have you been discriminated against or had assumptions against you because of your disability while on set?
Yeah, I mean, there's been assumptions. Yeah, I mean, I there's a couple of things. I took a job I was offered a job on a pilot, a series. And one of the things about the series in the pilot was that my character was supposed to sit in he was sort of an informant for the cops. And he was an otherworldly kind of character. So there was a lot of makeup involved. But the point of the joke was that he was supposed to sit in a child seat in the back of the cop car. And I objected to that. I just didn't like that idea of infantilizing my character. Even though he wasn't a real human, I still felt like there was going to be a connection to people with dwarfism and infantilizing them. So that was part of the agreement that I had verbally. I said I would not do that. But then on the day of the test, like the first screen test for this character, the prop guy came into the makeup trailer and said, what child seat do you want to use? And he showed me a bunch of child seats. And I said, well, we're not doing that. And he said, well, they just sent me over here to have you pick. And I said, well, tell them it's a mistake because I'm not sitting in the child seat. So then the producer came in and he said, you know, the network is really interested in you sitting in the child seat. And I said, well, we talked about this. I'm not going to do that. And then he said, well, let me talk. And then he came back and he said, they're really into this and they want you to do it. And they said, if you don't do it, they're going to send you home. And I said, okay, send me home. So I called their bluff and they didn't send me home and I didn't sit in the child seat. So I think they understood that, you know, from the get-go, that's just not how it's going to work. You know, if you make an agreement with me, you stick to it. And if I find something to be offensive or discriminatory, I'm going to address it. And you're going to have to be okay with me saying no. But, you know, I've also been told, I was told it was a very, very prominent hospital show on in the 90s. And I had asked my agent to put me in for this doctor role. And they came back and they said, well, he would never be a doctor. The belief system was that someone like me could not be a doctor. I have met little people doctors. There's a little person doctor on a TV series, a reality TV series. One of the heads of orthopedics at Johns Hopkins is a man with achondroplasia. He's a form of dwarfism. So he's a surgeon. And so that prejudice around whether or not I could be legitimately seen as a doctor in the 90s has since been dismissed. But I didn't get an opportunity for that role because of that belief system. And then growing up, I had a neighbor kid tell me that I could never be a trucker. And I said, well, first of all, I don't want to be a trucker. Second of all, I could do whatever I set my mind to. I mean, there'd be ways to, and he was explaining to me that the wheels are real big and I couldn't get my arms around them. I said, I'd figure it out. just a matter of adapting. Whatever it is, you adapt. And so we had this little back and forth when we were teenagers or whatever. And fast forward, 40 years, and I'm playing a truck driver of a big 18-wheel rig. So somebody suspended their disbelief enough to put me in the driver's seat.
So over the long arc of your career, would you say that things are changing for the better now?
In terms of disability, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I definitely believe that. Just out of the discussions I've been having with DEI teams throughout this industry. Yeah, and then I see real effort. I see concerted effort to help make changes and to understand and to engage.
For those not in the industry, what is DEI?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we add to accessibility, DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And of course, there's so much backlash against this concept of DEI and quote unquote wokeness. But I sum up wokeness as this: don't be a dick. That's what it comes down to. That's how you are woke. Don't be a dick.
Have DEI teams been there for 30, 40 years, or is this a brand new thing?
No, I don't think they have. I think my first experience is with any kind of a DEI team like this is probably with CBS. Working at CBS, and maybe 10 years ago, I might have heard of what DEI was. Maybe, definitely since 2015 or 16, but yeah, there's not a long history. I think it was just originally just sort of human resources, and maybe they were considering these concepts, but they were never, I don't think, ever thought of as DEI teams. I think that's just by the sheer numbers. I mean, if we go back to the year 2000, there were maybe 150 shows on TV, and now there's probably well over 500 that you can see in any number of platforms, right? So just based on numbers alone, we're getting more opportunity. I don't know if we still have this, if our percentages are increasing. I would say they are increasing, but the streamers aren't big on statistics because they don't want to be called out later.
Do you feel that there's been more progress made in scripted shows or in reality, or are they about on par in terms of representation?
Well, I think that there's a lot of reality shows that have come out, which I would not want to be a part of. But there's been some great reality shows. Push Girls was a great example. It profiled the 4 women who are wheelchair users, and there's Little People Big World. There's a couple of Little People shows out there. Some of them I think I find to be a little exploitative, but everybody has their thing they want to do. It might not be my flavor. I've been offered to be part of these reality concepts in the past that generally were not something I wanted to be a part of. I found them to be a little too exploitative for my taste. But that's not to say that they're not right for somebody else out there. I just hope the messaging doesn't get worse and worse. But I've never been a fan of reality TV on the whole. I find it, it's equal opportunity exploitation. Well, I think to anybody with a disability who's getting into this industry, look for the networking opportunities that are out there. Connect with any organizations that are disability focused and see what they know about this industry. See who contact, because I've worked with, the Disability Rights Legal Center. I've worked with the National Organization of Disability. So, all of these other organizations that are on the periphery of our industry, they have outreach and contacts within the industry. So you can begin your networking process just by reaching out to any number of disability related organizations, but also, search online for what's out there, what's available. There's just so many ways in which to connect today that didn't exist when I began. My connecting was, real time, showing up at an audition in a room full of, 15 little people, and then hearing stuff from them about what's out there and how to go about this or how to go about that. It's a different world we live in, and it's much easier to connect, I believe. And so be active, connect, network. And if you're going to get into this industry, know that it is a near impossible task to get to where you dream. But, set your sights and focus on it and get there as best as you can. One opportunity out there is the Easter Seals Disability Film Challenge, run by the great Nick Novicki. So that's one opportunity to create and circulate and network. And hopefully, if this is your passion, make sure you have another job. Make sure you can earn money somewhere else, some other way, because it's not necessarily a big money maker for a lot of people. But that doesn't mean you're not going to be happy doing everything that you do within this industry. And if you really feel like you have the talent, maintain your training, get on stage, even if it's just a public speaking forum, put yourself in front of an audience in some way, get to those places, get yourself comfortable in front of the camera, learn to talk to the camera, learn to talk camera adjacent, learn to talk to an audience. These are things you can teach yourself, and there's plenty of educational tools out there to enhance that ability. And if you're nonverbal, there's still ways in which to communicate, and capitalize on those if you happen to be nonverbal.
For more information, visit theavaproject.org.